The ability to record? Okay. And then let's see. Could you make me co-host then?
Mm-hmm. Um,
Okie dokie. Awesome. And then I should also be able to let people in, and you should be able to also introduce himself. And I know we have a good amount of San Jose State people, but it's nice to just kind of facilitate that. So if you want to do a quick little introduction in the chat, that would be awesome. And again, we're going to begin really soon. All right, so Izzy, I think we can get started with the recording whenever you're ready. It's recording. Okay, I didn't get the notification, but hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, having this nice little conversation with my presentation from the closet to the band room, a future music educator's outlook on inclusivity in the music room. Yes, I'm a little bit extra that I love doing these small little things with PowerPoint. So my name is AJ Gonzales. I'm a fourth year music ed student at San Jose State University. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm also advocacy chair for San Jose State's Collegiate NAfME chapter. So without a further ado, I think to get started, you may be wondering, who am I? So there are three facets to this, and we're going to start with my background, really sweet and simple. So I grew up part of my childhood in the Bay Area. I grew up in Milpitas, and I always have had music with me. I was quite literally named after a Backstreet Boy member, and I always danced to Destiny Child music videos that my parents would play like on DVD. Super loved Beyonce, obviously, and also like Backstreet Boys, just like pop, R&B. So I was always surrounded by music, and as you can probably see by the left picture, I was also a very bubbly little kid. As you can even tell with me today, I love smiling. I'm pretty animated. I use my hand a lot when I explain things. So it's just kind of always been who I am. And I also grew up as a single child in a Filipino American household. So kind of part of being Filipino American and being Asian is that I was always pushed to be a certain type of way in terms of being a student, having really good grades, what type of career I should have. More specifically with Filipinos, it's usually going to the STEM route, and you're either a doctor or a nurse. You may have heard of that. I know a few of you are Filipinos, so if you can relate, that's kind of the route that I was pushed towards, but I was like really passionate about music. So I did band starting in middle school in seventh grade, and that's where the right picture comes in. You could probably kind of tell who's me based off of the very flamboyant red skinny jeans and the purple Adidas shirt and the Justin Bieber hair that doesn't match anything whatsoever. Um, was not a look, but as you can kind of see though, is that I found family. I found a lot of comfort during this time um, through personal familial conflicts and just understanding myself and my sexual orientation and my upbringing. I found a lot of peace and joy being in the band room and finding real friends that carried on to my high school experience and just kind of solidifying who I was as an individual. So that leads on to my education. So going into high school, I was super into music. I was introduced to marching band for the first time. It was really scary, but it was actually kind of the reason why I'm here today as a music ed major. I was drum major, as you can see in the middle picture. That was such a huge thing in terms of building myself as a person because I was a super timid, shy person compared to my little child self. And being drum major kind of just got me closer to that again and being able to help my friends create music, teach marching band. It was really a great experience. So, with that, I decided to pursue music and music education, and I'm here today at San Jose State, and I've been really blessed to have all the opportunities that I've had with the marching band, being the current drum major, one of the drum majors, and also being super involved with the department. I um, was just recent past vice president from UPhi Epsilon. I've always been super involved with NAfME, so it's always been a really phenomenal experience in terms of how I experienced music and how it's gotten me here. Um, so, with that comes my identity, who I am as a person. So, with all my experiences, it was really hard to kind of figure out my way. I was always very blinded by the fact that I had to constantly prove myself to other people, and I just really couldn't see where my success was going. But fairly recently, I came down to the conclusion that my success isn't defined by my skin or sexual orientation. And I think that's something that's really, really, really important to stress to our students today and put into our pedagogy. Um, every band space and ensemble that I've been a part of has always let me grow in that type of way. And that's why I feel so fortunate to be where I am. So, and I was figuring this out in high school. You know, my sexual orientation, the ways that I succeed and excel through music was because of my experiences before college. So it's really up to us as future educators to continue this and just start fostering other students' excellence. So you may be wondering why I'm super passionate about this. And it's because I've never really experienced any type of instruction from directors that looked or identified like me. And it really affected my own personal experience and how I kind of just perceived music as a whole. So, with that, we're going to talk about how it has affected my perception of inclusion in the band room. So, there's three main chunks that go with this. And this may look a little familiar if you have seen my summer presentation with Dominic Samuels. Um, but the three of them, the first one is being hyper aware of the queer narrative. So what I mean by that is like not waving like pride flags all around, and I'm saying that only LGBTQ plus people and people of color are the only people that should be teaching music, but I look at it as leaving space for our allies, which some of you may be, to make informed decisions about talking about these concepts and including LGBTQ plus composers and talking about the history um, of the community outside of music. So next, we also have the value in fostering safe spaces. Again, having a safe space and acknowledging to your students that they are safe to just create music and grow as a musician and as a person in your band room is integral to ensure that they grow. And of course, the last one is probably the most important is that connections are the most powerful form, excuse me, to shape the human condition. And it's always fathomed me how personal music has always been. The connections that you, as a director, as a conductor, make to the musicians, your students, and the connections that you make about the music to display it through sound orally is something that I've always learned to appreciate. And it's something that is learned and we'll talk about in more depth. So, with the first portion, we have the queer narrative. So, before I really get into what I mean by that and how it's affected me, I have to address queer theory. So, queer theory is essentially just a sub-study of sexuality studies and rejects the hierarchical binaries that is used in our society based on social constructionism. And we'll talk about social constructionism later on, but essentially it just negates the whole concept of there's only male and female, there's only straight or homosexual. There's a wide spectrum that goes within and beyond that. And queer theory also further recognizes the fluidity and that it's not an attribute simply assigned to a person fixed upon birth and determined by biology, but an identity that is shaped culturally and through an individual's performance within or transgressing gender expectations. So, with that in mind, now we can talk about how does this affect the music space? So, there's a sense of inherent privilege that comes to studying music as a cisgender, heterosexual, and possibly even Caucasian individual. And this clearly dates all the way back to medieval music. Now, I'm not going to go into a music history lecture because we've probably all had a lot of those at this point. But it's pretty clear, like in medieval music, in the Renaissance era, there was a sense of privilege that came from the upper class studying music and being able to have access to instruments. And it's kind of circled around to this modern day and being aware about that and how accessibility really affects people of color and minorities. And like I've stated before, I have never really felt, seen, or heard as a queer Filipino American musician. Um, for me, in like Filipino community, I'm 6 foot tall. I am very gay, and I have dyed hair and piercings, and I'm pursuing music. That is like completely opposite of what normal Catholic, religious, Filipino based families really want their sons and daughters to like pursue. So I always felt the need to prove to my disapproving family that music was a sustainable career, and to my peers and director at the time of my quality work that it's really possible to for me to become a director. And that's kind of where my whole philosophy of the music space has really been shaped. And also, something that's really important to address is that there's a set of inherent biases that affect our own personal perception of the music space and music as as a profession. Um, Not even just with race and gender, which is really big portions, but also just the social circle that comes with the politics of being a musician and finding a job. It's made it really hard these days. So there's always a form of inherent biases that carry on beyond what we can see. And also the construction of stereotype that feminine individuals play flute and boys play percussion. You know, again, that's just one of many different types of examples of social constructionism that we'll be talking about later. And we ultimately have inherently failed our students the moment we limit their exposure to music based on their identity. And I think this really just drives home the concept of just being inclusive and providing a safe space is that we want to ensure that we expose all types of students to all types of music and just moving forward as people to make sure that they're growing. So, talking about biases real quick, we have so many different types, but the ones that I'm going to talk about super prevalent is conformity bias. It's also known as the bandwagon effect. And it's the tendency for people to take their cues for proper ethical behavior from their peers instead of exercising their own ethical judgment. Honestly, we see this a lot with like social media and people just accepting a lot of truth from people that are within their circles that put in or share information that may not be entirely correct, rather than exercising your own opinion and going through a thought process of what you think is morally correct. And then we also have self-serving bias, which is the justification of a good result from an event to be your own work, but blaming external factors as a result of one's failures. So, best example is the picture on your right. Super quirky. I love this. It was really funny when I found it. But you got the left chicken being like, "You've got a problem with avoiding your personal accountability." And the right chicken is like, "Yeah, and whose fault is that?" And like clearly the right chicken doesn't understand that. Like, people tend to just really blame external factors for their own shortcomings, and that's some a type of bias in and of itself. And I'm sure this one doesn't need too much explanation, but stereotyping is also a form of bias, which is like expecting a group to have certain qualities or a person due to social constructs without having real information about the person. And that heavily affects how we perceive the music space and how we treat our students. So, with that, there's going to be our first discussion portion. So, just to kind of put the topic in, what kind of biases do you acknowledge in your everyday life? Maybe as a musician, as a conductor, maybe even like your own personal life. Um, some personal examples are generalized preferences. They're also considered biases. It can also be as minute as coffee over tea, pineapple on pizza or not, but obviously on a larger spectrum. Stereotyping, confirmation bias, which is listening to only info that confirms our preconceptions, and of course, racial bias. So, just want to give a few seconds, and if anybody's comfortable and willing, you can talk about it, we can share, we can discuss. Um, and don't be afraid. You can just like raise your hand, or it's a small enough group. You can just unmute yourself and share your experiences if you are comfortable.
Kind of for me, when I first got into music, I played the flute, just because our family already had one and it just was convenient to not have to rent something. But then I realized that I really wanted to play saxophone, and a lot of people were very confused by that. They're like, "What?" Because I was a really shy girl back then, a really shy girl, not outgoing, and so they just were confused by my choice of instrument, even though it shouldn't really matter, and kind of made me feel like, oh, I don't belong. Like I shouldn't be in playing this instrument. Why am I doing this? I should just go back to flute. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, actually, my first instrument that I wanted to play was flute, and then my director was like, "Nah, you're gonna play saxophone." So it was kind of just like one of those weird things. It was like, but why? There wasn't a single like male flute in our ensemble. So it was definitely one of those things I would think just from my own experience. Um, Anything else that anybody may have experienced, or just analyzing music and the music industry?
I know that there are some general stereotypes for different groups of instruments. Like, I don't know, clarinets are the weirdos, or flutes are the giggly type of people, or sopranos are divas. There are all sorts of different stereotypes that we just kind of take for granted. And what does that say about us?
Hmm. Exactly. Just putting people in a particular mindset and like not looking into the person itself, and like you can say the same thing about saxophone players and French horn players. I get the stereotype of like I'm a big introvert, or I it's clearly not the case because like but I definitely agree, and it's really prevalent in the media as well. The one thing that came to mind when you said that was Glee. And Leah Michelle was like the super sassy like soprano, I think. But like things like that also show up in general society and how we perceive people and music. So moving on, I have another question is what forms of privilege do you acknowledge within yourself or the field of music? Um, so again, just repeating, what forms of privilege do you acknowledge within yourself and the field of music? So privilege shows up in like many different ways than we expect. So um, the most not the most obvious one, but one that comes to mind for me is material and educational. So the type of school you attend, your resources to ensembles, resources to your own instruments, your own upbringing and access to those materials, gender and gender identity. And the third one is to be passing. So this term may or may not have been something that you've heard of before, but I guess as an example for Latinos or Latinas or even like half Asian Americans, to be white passing is basically where your complexion and how you perceive yourself outwardly can be considered as a Caucasian person. Um, and then also straight passing. So, I mean, other than like my floral shirt and my dyed hair and my piercings, well, on a normal day, I can just be straight passing due to certain stereotypes. And that's also a form of privilege, especially for our trans community and trans women of color. It's very hard to be passing for transgendered individuals. So that is also a form of privilege.
Just for me on this list, like I think, um, like your educational privilege, I've kind of noticed it lately, just because I've been thinking about it. Is like, like education is very like classist, and people get more opportunity than others. Just and then for the privilege walk questions, um, a big thing that came up in the past 4 years is like my dad's from Ireland and he's white, and we had conversations about if he wasn't white, there would be a possibility that even though he has a citizenship, that he would be deported and we wouldn't have any way to live because he's the person that makes all the money in the household. And that was like kind of like wow, like that was a big realization on my part just in general. Ken, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, can I lower my hand? I can lower my hand. I think like in regards to privilege, particularly in our field, um, yeah, it's something that I definitely acknowledge. Not something that I really, albeit like was aware of. Maybe it wasn't until like the last few years I kind of looked back and I looked back and realized the amount of privilege I had. I as coming from an Asian American household with those expectations that a lot of Asian American kids have, as you discussed, AJ. Um, I was really, 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 really lucky and grateful to have parents that were supportive of me and come from a financially stable house to do things like lessons and um, you know drum corps and like all these some workshops and like all these other things to help me be the best self that I could be. But recognize and I think recognizing that privilege, that it is a privilege, is very important.
Yeah, yeah, and I definitely agree. Shoko, I see your hand. Um, but with my own personal experiences that I've really just started analyzing within the past few years, kind of like Izzy, like you too. I've been seeing that my opportunities that I've been given to go to San Jose State almost nearly debt free or at least with minimal student loan um, being pulled out, and also having scholarships and having those opportunities being given to me to even access education like this. Um, was a form of privilege that I didn't really acknowledge at first. So it like came as a shock to me when I started to like understand that. And then also I didn't acknowledge the privilege walk questions, but the privilege walk is an activity that was created by I forgot what college it was specifically, but essentially what it was is that they put various types of students in a line horizontally, and they would ask these questions that would be forms of privilege in terms of how they grew up socioeconomically or as people, and if there was ever a moment that they did experience privilege, such as are you a U.S. citizen? Does your family have health insurance? They would take a step forward. But if there was a type of setback, such as being a person of color or being afraid of being pulled over by the police, you would take a step back. So those are also questions to kind of further this conversation. But Shoko?
Yeah, I know in terms of music, well, in general, I didn't realize how privileged I was until I got to college. I thought I had a very normal childhood. Um, but then when I got to college, I realized that how very privileged I was. Um, I remember preparing to work with these middle school kids after school and basically introduce them to like basic musical concepts as they're waiting for their parents to come pick them up. And it was a Title I school, and this was in Syracuse. And Syracuse is a refugee hub, much like Baltimore. So 1 in 10 children are refugees. Um, so I thought they're in 7th, 8th grade. Okay, we can learn about like cannons. We can like talk about like we could sing like row, row, row your boat and like doing it in the round. And I thought that was simple enough. But like because of my privileged background, I didn't realize how difficult of a task even singing a melody would be, much less communicating my ideas to them, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like hearing a tune, understanding the words. I didn't realize that my childhood was much different from theirs and that my lesson plan came from a place of privilege almost. I don't know. But yeah, that was a shock to me.
Yeah, it was. I think I've also had this conversation with Ken a little bit about your experience with your school specifically, and your middle schools within your district, and how students have had like a really hard time understanding basic rhythms. And I thought that was like such a different shock to me because when I grew up in middle school, I didn't say this, but I grew up in middle school north of Sacramento, in Placer County, if you know where that is. And it's very Caucasian oriented and very um, privileged, to make a long story short. And I went to a really nice middle school, and my director every single day would make us sight read rhythms, and he would like just obviously with the complexity of it, and he would like play songs and excerpts from different types of genres, like literally rock and classical and alternative and jazz, and would expose us to all these types of things, and getting to like even just teaching my own students and seeing them having a hard time with understanding rhythm, it like made me kind of reflect that, oh, that was also like a form of privilege, is like having that type of education isn't just something that is always given or always granted in every single music space. So moving forward with that, I want to talk about safe spaces. So what is a safe space? Um, a safe space is a place intended to be free of bias, conflict, criticism, or potentially threatening actions, ideas, or conversations. So I think this is really important because it places into the subconscious mind of a student that you, as a teacher, are ensuring their education first and that you're willing to accept and teach anyone and everyone. And I think that just comes with teaching music in general. That's like the beauty of it, is that everyone can enjoy, can learn music. Um, and all students deserve the same amount of opportunities for growth and success. So I learned this really interesting thing when I was studying for this presentation and figuring out what I wanted to talk about. And I ran into this study about moving from avoidance to empathy. So one of the default positions that we can like possibly go to with any controversial or taboo topic is to agree to disagree on issues. Um, in my high school experience, like I said, I grew up in a very white area. My high school's demographic was majority white, and then next Latinx, and then there's such a small Asian minority within that. And I remember like throughout my 4 years, there'd always be um, one peer of mine in a class that would get into a conversation with me whenever I would talk about LGBTQ topics or if it was ever mentioned, and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm okay that you're gay, but it's still a sin." And it's like it didn't really click. It was like the person was trying to agree to disagree, and it kind of just ruminated, and it's like always stuck to me um, throughout my 4 years and even now, because like this strategy in particular allows for a truce, but it just limits our communication as people. We start to shut down um, this barrier, um, and fearing confrontation just makes people avoid each other, um, and just avoiding the conversation. In the past few years, and even just my experiences in music and ensembles before I got to college, um, there was never really talk about LGBTQ plus composers, arrangers, musicians, even Black composers and musicians. Um, and the people in my band were primarily diverse. It was very split between um, white Caucasian, Asian American, and Latinx predominantly. And I had a very, very white, privileged director. So it was really hard for him to connect to us as people. And he never really communicated that. He never really put in the effort to program any pieces by these minority composers. So my first understanding and my first experience of such composers and such works was from college, my college ensembles. And that was a culture shock in and of itself. Um, and to kind of bring it back to avoidance to empathy, it's super important to move away from that and to move beyond avoiding that conversation. Um, and that teachers can seek a more practical alternative by practicing and teaching empathy. So there's a nursing scholar, her name is Teresa Wiseman. She describes the four tenets of empathy to be as such listed: to be able to see the world as others see it, to be non-judgmental, to understand another person's feelings, and to communicate the understanding of person's feelings. So empathy, really hard to talk about, really hard to teach, and even just like experiencing and learning how to act in an empathetic manner is really hard. It's a constant practice. And I put right here, sympathy is feeling sorry for someone, while empathy is feeling with someone. So it's more than just having a student present their opinion or their experiences and then being like, oh yeah, okay, and then next. It's really about giving space for your students to speak their truth and speak their experiences to help facilitate a broader conversation beyond the music that we're teaching. And also to help students understand, and also especially yourself as the director, that it's not your space to correct, object, or diminish someone else's truth. I'm going to say that again. Help yourself and also help your students understand that it's not your space to correct, object, interject, or even diminish someone else's truth. really, really, really important concept to take in for empathy. So, how can an individual facilitate a safe space? There are quite multiple ways. The most obvious one that I'm sure we've all probably heard of is programming minority composers that not only represent the members of your ensembles, but also reflect other communities and significant events in society. Um, there's a piece that our wind ensemble played called "A Mother of a Revolution" by Omar Thomas. It's a wind ensemble piece, super cool, super funky, and like super spicy. And it's in celebration of Martha P. Johnson, who was a trans Black woman who really paved the way for gay liberation and the queer community in the late 1960s and 70s. Um, and to see to just see that and to hear that that's what that piece was about when I first attended the concert, like it just made me so emotional. Like that's something that means so much to me, and I never got to see anything like that in my music career when I was younger, when it was so important for me to see things like that. And I put a resource right there that you've all probably heard of, and it's composerdiversity.com. You can look at any type of composer, any that identify within a certain minority, um, Black, Latino, Latina, Asian, Asian American, LGBTQ plus, and it's a really great first step to start composing works and concert sets to be more diverse. Also teaching about LGBTQ plus composers and not just discussing heterosexual relationships in contexts such as in music history and opera. And the first thing that comes to mind is Aaron Copland and the discrimination that he faced. Um, Another one that is more recent is Julie Giroux. She is a queer woman who is a very prominent composer that's coming up in our industry right now, and just understanding the effects of why it's taken so long for these composers to be acknowledged. Um, and also learning more about just beyond LGBTQ plus topics such as disability inclusion and multicultural education, and to train pre-service teachers on LGBTQ plus issues. And I know districts and accessibility to have that type of training can be very hit or miss. So being able to do that on your own, you know, it's also on you to do the research to make sure that you're informed as well. In anti-harassment, allyship, and the use of more inclusive language in the classroom. So transitioning to gender neutral alternatives when addressing students. So I put right here as like an example is like, girls, imagine a guy that you really like. But instead of doing that, you should switch over to everyone imagine someone you really like. And it really taps into the ambiguity of the music and the form. And I'm sure all of us have suffered through this next one, and addressing a group of people as, hey guys. You know, I do that a lot teaching high school marching band. It's a really quick thing to say, just, hey guys, let's focus in, blah, blah, blah. But instead of doing that, I would highly recommend using my
Y'all.
personal favorite, y'all. And
Yes.
it's, hi, Jake. Um,
Sorry.
and yeah, so y'all is like my favorite term. I know we're not from the South, but it's such a really great neutral term and it catches people's attention, especially here in California. Like people don't do that. So like I really catch my kids off guard when I'm like, hey y'all, let's like try and do this. And they're like, what? Why are you saying that? And it's like turned into a joke where my kids like jump into their like ensemble rehearsals like on Zoom and they try and scare each other to think that like I popped in to like help out or something. So it's like a cute little thing now, but it's a really great way to just address everyone neutrally. And teachers you should just like take advantage of that ambiguity and essential gender neutrality that comes with music, like I said. And then also using Wiseman's model of empathy and ambiguity, um, or sorry, using Wiseman's model of empathy to teach and engage your students in conversations and interpretations with each other, in engaging on non-judgmental hearing and reflecting and understanding other viewpoints. Um, and that teachers can engage students in critical thinking. And that's kind of just one thing that I've started to learn how to do. And like one way you can do this is what my mentor teacher that I teach high school marching band had told me was sending the kids with a really small assignment, like one paragraph to two paragraphs, to look up a composer and the piece that they're playing, and then like learn out, oh, Julie Giroux, she's a female composer that is LGBTQ plus identifying. This is what this piece is about. Then you can come back to the rehearsal space and have this discussion in a really empathetic manner, having different types of perspectives. And in other words, who belongs and how might we open the doors of access so that all people feel represented. And I think that exercise in particular is like a really great way to get started into doing that. Um, because these questions allow students to consider a wide variety of life experiences. Because I mean, I know we're all fairly young right now, like we're all in our early to mid 20s, and we especially have a lot of life to live. So just imagine it from the student's standpoint. Being able to expose them to that is really valuable. And then probably the most simple one for me personally is showing concerted efforts to show support. Like having a safe space sticker or the equality symbol. This is from the Human Rights Campaign, if you can see me. And they're all about LGBTQ plus inclusivity and providing resources to everyone about um, the community and what types of resources are available. Um, and having stickers like that, or just it's a subtle yet non-verbal message that all are welcome. So this is going to be our last discussion portion, but just to kind of dig a little deeper into the conversation, I wanted to ask, how do you show empathy to others, whether it be your peers, fellow students, family members, and how do you or how can you teach empathy to your students? I want y'all to think about that for a minute. I put examples, but I don't want to like spoil it because they're also my answers. And I wanted to hear how you all engage in empathy and teaching empathy. So for me, at a young age, I always was taught that homosexuality was unacceptable, that Black and Latino individuals were dangerous and to never like be interacting with them, and that music wasn't a foreseeable career to pursue. Um, and obviously, that's very clearly not empathetic. It shows a lot of bias, and it's it was really hard for me to challenge that and to just understand how can I show empathy for these types of people, for myself, even like as a queer person of color. How can I challenge my values and how can I pay it forward as a human individual? Can you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I'm. This is how I've been doing it now, and I don't know if this is necessarily accomplishing it, but it's at least getting the discussion going within my kids. I've been playing. We listen to groups, and we listen to groups play music. I think the most important thing, or the way that I've been trying to do it, is playing the music that they can really latch onto,
Mhm.
and on a visceral level. Like I played them Statement, for example, and they were absolutely hooked to it. Like, yeah, this is super engaging. This is super relevant. It's like, okay, understand that you have the capacity to also impact someone like that, so impact other people like that piece just impacted you, and teaching empathy and teaching them to understand the importance of what we can do as artists through our craft and how we can influence other people and have and communicate whatever the composer intended, um, and communicate it to the audience. And I think for me that it's like to start it and then just trying to really drive the point home of how, being able to communicate what the composer is trying to do, understand the value of what this, like, because really, like, I think to feel right, we're really, when we're trying to communicate the art, when we're trying to communicate the music, we're really trying to communicate the feel, the affect, the emotion behind it. And I think to that extent, you are really, it kind of does force you to be empathetic, or it's teaching you to become empathetic. And how can we process that and communicate that, to the audience? And
Hmm.
that's how I've been trying to do it. I'm not necessarily sure if that is the way or if that even is accomplishing empathy, but it's how I've been doing it so far. And it's at least getting the discussion started about talking about, it allows us to have these discussions of what's going on in the world, how it affects other people, what can we do, how can we influence the people around us to make the world just a little bit better.
Yeah, no, I definitely really agree with all of that, and it's definitely like a great first start. And um, I think it's just like something that I've been taught innately that has been like touched on in terms of my own musical experience, but I really didn't get to delve into it until I got to college. So being able to give that opportunity, um, yeah, Shoko, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I remember once one of my band directors in high school was talking about how um, being a good musician is a lot like being a good person because you have to pay attention to what everyone else is saying in order to appropriately respond. And I think just having a discussion with my kids, I haven't had this opportunity, but I just thought about that. Um, I think it makes them think a little bit more about what they're doing in their hands and also using it as a tangible model as to how their society around them works socially, and
Mhm.
just saying like this is how we do in music, but how does that translate into real life? How could we benefit our real life examples based on what my band teacher is telling me to do? um but yeah, that's that for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that too. That's um, actually a really good driving point that I haven't really considered that much because I think students get really stagnated, and we kind of see this in politics where people just get super disconnected from reality and what's happening around us, that they just don't pay attention to these things. And I think students feel that way to a certain extent about certain things, and they kind of just assume all these things. So just making sure that we get them to think about that is really important. But my examples were just leaving space in the conversation to allow the individual to speak their truth. So kind of like what Ken, like what you were doing, being able to dig deeper, and letting your students engage in the conversation and putting in their input is something that I was thinking about. And also engaging discussion, but not necessarily interjecting with your own opinions and beliefs, really being the listener. Um, in my own personal group of friends, and whenever I get into discussions with people, I tend to just kind of listen. And that's not the ADHD in me that's trying to catch up to people's conversation, but I really do try and make sure to listen to what's happening and just making sure that I'm taking in what people are experiencing, what type of things they're feeling, and responding accordingly. And it's something that we all just have to constantly take into account. Um, and that also leads into the next point, which is what kind of social constructs have you been taught? This is kind of leading into our next conversation and what I'll be talking about. But a social construct is not raw facts about the world. So examples could be music. So it's the opinion that X music is superior to Y music, or like classical music is more professional and impressive than jazz. And also gender identity and gender expression, we see it as being blue is for male, pink is for female, or like only boys can play percussion and girls can play flute, that there's only boys and girls. Um, these are the different types of social constructs. So just take a couple seconds, kind of think about what type of social constructs you've been taught. For me, very clearly, it's I've been taught and I've been told actually that because I'm tall, that I should be a basketball player. And I'm like, what is that? That's kind of like, I don't like sports. I want to make music, but it's kind of that association of you're tall and you're in shape. You should be able to do something like athletics, like a sport. Um, but it's like, I just kind of want to make music. That's kind of an example of a social construct.
I can't find the raise hand button, but I know for me, um, like a big social construct is like only guys play low brass, and like you repeatedly see. I mean, I personally repeatedly see that in like my everyday life, I guess, since I'm a music major. And like the girls in the trombone studio at San Jose State have gotten even smaller, and like what's that saying about our education system, that there's mostly guys and there's not a lot of females that want to continue playing trombone. And so I don't know, I just like um I think that's for me, like that's a big social construct, and like figuring out how to try to break that, like that it's
Hmm.
not like a man's land. Like you just
Yeah.
gotta like, and it sounds terrible, but like, guys could be guys, and like, you know, girls and guys aren't necessarily the same, and like you kind of just have to push through and like deal with some of the behavior that comes with working with immature dudes. I don't know. Um, yeah.
Yeah. No, I definitely understand. Like, I think the brass world in general as a whole is very male driven and like the testosterone of it all. And, you know, the very the very thought of like emerging female brass players just in our industry, I personally I'm not good with names, but I also just can't really think of that many in terms of the brass world. Um, so yeah, definitely that is a really big social construct that kind of goes beyond um, music as well. Shoko, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, something that I noticed in like, especially in like high school, I feel like a general social construct is like if you get first chair in all state, like you're better than everyone else.
Hmm.
When really it's just that's how the audition went. And I feel as though like there are some aspects of STEM area of academia as in being very competitive, always having the right answer, that kind of trickle down into music through our school system somehow about being number one instead of being compassionate. And I feel as though that's like a social construct that will take a while or may never go away in the music world, but it's something that I hope to work on with my kids.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just from my own personal experiences with auditions, um, in particular with like ensembles in college and my experiences with drum corps in particular, there's a lot of drive within talent and ability. Um, and I feel very fortunate because the ensemble that I was performing with, they were all about also work ethic and just you as a person being able to incorporate yourself into one organization rather than purely just looking at the statistics and the consistency and how you are on paper. So, and you also mentioned like just connecting. So that also like really just leads into the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is connections and the human condition. And this is something that I am personally like, I super geek out about sometimes. And I just love thinking about the way the mind works and how we interact with people and how our experiences really shape the condition and how we interact. And I found this definition of the human condition being that it encompasses the totality of the experience that of being human and living lives, and is also used in a metaphysical sense to describe joy, terror, and other feelings or emotions associated with being and existing. And most popular example I could think of was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You may have seen this if you have studied like AP psychology at all, but essentially at the very bottom, there are basic needs that we need to be fulfilled, like food, water. Next is security and safety. Then we get to psychological needs, such as intimate relationships, friends, feeling accomplishment. And then we get to the very top, which is self-actualization. And that's achieving one's full potential, making ensuring that we're including creative activities in this as well. And then also just human self-reflection. And we'll be talking about philosophy later on, but just being able to sit and reflect. And I think that's really what we've been able to do in this time of a pandemic is just being able to sit and reflect on ourselves, on everything that we just about really. And to continue off of that, I talked about social constructs. So social constructionism is a theory of knowledge that holds that characteristics are typically thought to be immutable and solely biological. So essentially speaking, the human it's a theory of knowledge that states that things that you were born with and are products of human definition and interpretation that are shaped by cultural and historical context. So just kind of continuing with that, like things like gender, race, class, ability, sexuality, those are things that are socially embedded into society through history and culture, and what we learn as people and what's acceptable innate behavior. Um, and to just kind of continue with that, it also highlights that like physical constructs is not to say that they don't necessarily exist, but that that context and cultural history affect things such as race and socioeconomic status. So one thing that I've kind of put to kind of wrap this together is this picture that says reflections in this mirror may be distorted by socially constructed ideas of beauty. And that's something that is a really big concept to deconstruct, but it's not the topic that we're talking about. So moving forward is the ins and outs of the human mind. And there are two particular parts. So it's all the brain stuff and then how it relates to teaching music. I love this stuff. I've been taking several philosophy courses throughout my time here at San Jose State. I also took like psychology in high school. And, you know, I have had these really deep conversations and I've had friends take philosophy courses and they just absolutely hate it. And it's really intriguing because philosophy is all about the mind and assessing and questioning the self. And the reason why is like, oh, you're using your mind and you have to think about yourself. So I just think it's like this coming of full circle. But I think it's really important and necessary to assess yourself in being a really good educator and bringing it into music. So we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud really quick. He was an Austrian neurologist, and he made a really profound impact in psychology. You may have heard of the Freudian slip, which is essentially you say one thing, but then cognitively you meant another thing, and it just kind of like slips out, such as like calling someone by a different name. like supernaturally. I'm sure that has happened to all of us before. But I call Sigmund Freud the ego killer, particularly because he cracks down on the effect of the ego in the human mind. And it's, you may have heard it before, like calling someone egotistical or having a really big ego. So in more psychological terms, he showcases that a human's personality is composed of three elements that interact and influence us as people. So we start off with the left, with the id, and it's composed of biological instinctual drives that start at infancy, and basically outlines primitive behaviors like those bare bone basic needs from Maslow. It's like baby need wawa and need food. So that's kind of where that goes, and being able to seek immediate gratification for these behaviors and your like instincts. And then we move over to the ego, which deals with the reality of it all and ensures impulses from the id can be expressed in an acceptable manner, and basically just holds it in check, to help achieve the gratification within the confines of reality. Essentially, there's a time and place for everything. And then we go a step beyond that, which is the super ego, and it starts to develop at around age 5, which is when us as humans get to understand the constructs of moral and social standards that we get from society, that we get from our parents. And I put here, it's basically the Judge Judy of our brain. It's kind of like that ruler, and just kind of strikes and helps the ego kind of get to this essence of being really genuinely um, rational, and attempts to make the ego act upon idealistic standards as such. And there's also the conception of the conscious and how it affects our mind. So, in terms of the surface level, we also have thoughts and perceptions. This is kind of what we see. This is the iceberg before the Titanic. We kind of just see this out of nowhere. It's the most aware of what lies within our external world and how we kind of process that. Then we have our subconscious, which is all about stored knowledge, memories, and this affects our ego and how we act morally, because it's something that we carry around with us. We don't necessarily see it, we don't necessarily think about it all the time, but it is stored knowledge that we use to infer and make assumptions and act. And then at the very, very deep, we have the unconscious level, which are deep underlying thoughts, fears, irrational wishes. These don't show up like at our conscious or subconscious, but they affect us just as much. One thing that I relate this in terms of music is performance anxiety. And it's not entirely, like, it cannot entirely be about being scared about the performance. It could be that your family's in the audience and they've never seen you perform live with your ensemble, or you may have had a really rough week academically and you have to really focus in on other things. Those types of pressures can really take on you as a person to feel that type of performance anxiety, because it's dealing on the unconscious level. It's something that you don't really get to mentally think about. And then moving on, my favorite is behavioral ethics. So essentially, philosophy and ethics specifically is just the study of good and bad decisions. And you may have heard of this before, but essentially, um, the there's like this trolley problem in ethics, that essentially you're stuck on a trolley and you have this lever to go to the left or right. You can't stop the trolley at all. It just keeps going. And on the left side, you have an old elderly woman. And then on the right, you have, let's say, a family of four with two really young children. So obviously, your trolley can't stop. So it's going to obviously kill the grandma, the old lady, or the family. So it's up to you to now think, which side do I want to go? And like, obviously, it's like you want to be morally correct and be like, oh, but the grandma, she's so pure. We associate like old women and the elderly and young children as like really valuable. But then you have the family where there's the sum of the whole, where there's four people to save and there's young children. So you can also argue like they have life to live. So that's basically what behavioral ethics really deals with. So if you think about relating it to how people just kind of perceive good and bad as a whole, you could just channel into your days in high school, and your ability to judge right and wrong actions. And they probably fall in line to what your students experience. And it's important to understand as an educator that external factors also come into play that affect our understanding of where they're coming from, such as the hive mind or societal pressure, because they really make it difficult to perceive what is morally correct unless they have a clear stance of themselves, or they have really good variety of teachers and role models that shape their perception of right and wrong in the classroom. Um, and you might be saying, my mind is scary. Like, yes, that's okay. The more we get to understand ourselves and our values, the more space we open up to be empathetic to our students. Um, and just being able to understand ourselves is also just like a really valuable life skill. Um, so how does this relate to teaching music in particular? Um, I think the first job as a conductor of any ensemble is to connect to the students, taking the time to understand their needs and to really tap into that and allow a space for them to grow and expand on new life concepts, all while guiding them to moral excellence. And also, as a director, you can be empathetic, but also drawing those boundaries and being able to have a conversation about it, being able to listen to the opinions, leaving space for that, but also just addressing that you won't condone any form of racism, homophobia, xenophobia, and here's why. Here's why this is wrong. You are, in essence, someone that puts them morally on the right foot, in the right track. And we can have the power to do that in music. And I believe that we have to continue to challenge our ego in every aspect of life to prepare ourselves for the job, because it's not easy and it's absolutely not cute. Um, and just how to incorporate this into your pedagogy is just giving yourself time to learn and understand your core beliefs and values. Because the more they're in line with what you want your students to get out of band, the more effective you'll be to make a lasting impact on them. Um, and also, just as important is that understanding that there's a learning curve to every teenager and every circumstance is different. And at the end of the day, you're challenging the students, but also the challenge comes from yourself. You also have to understand their point of view and their perspective of learning. And that's really the hardest part. And to do it organically, for them to express themselves safely, it's something really, really difficult to just encapsulate that. And it's a continuing conversation to build that empathy and to build that trust with students. Because our student stagnation starts from our own. And I'm a very firm believer of that. Just from my own personal experiences with school, I got really complacent at one point within my 4 years here, because I was like, oh, I'm in a leadership position. Things are going where I need it to be. And then at that point, I got comfortable and I started seeing a plateau. So now getting out of that, is something that is of challenge. And, we may come into a program where there are some really high standards to be met. And, sometimes we don't want to plateau that. So just continuing with growth and ensuring that there's growing together. So what can we do as future educators? This essentially sums up everything. Is my cursor is blocking the way. So including works that are either composed by LGBTQ plus composers, and works that highlight events or celebrate the community. Just like I said, before A Mother Revolution by Omar Thomas. Um, and also considering Matthew Shepard, it's not a band piece, but it's a really beautiful work by Craig Hella Johnson that really talks about the experience of Matthew Shepard, who was a gay college student that was found left for dead um, in a pasture, essentially. So, and it's a really powerful, moving work to consider and to even just show your kids these types of works to celebrate the community. Next, we also have verbally acknowledging that your band room is a safe space for all your students to excel. And then finally, being able to inform students of resources they can access on campus, online, or if they're not comfortable with coming to you. I know for me, I was actually vice president of my Gay Straight Alliance. It is now known as the Gender and Sexuality Association. So being able to maybe direct them to them and whoever the teaching facilitator is for that club, and just giving them the opportunity to know who they can go to if it's not you in particular. And then, of course, big one, continuing to educate yourself. Really, really, really big one. It always starts with us, like I mentioned before. So just to leave you with some things to be aware about, are students' gender identity and individual preferred pronouns. As you can see, having just even acknowledging he, him, his, they, them, those are really, really good opportunities. And you can do it through Zoom. People have the opportunity to adjust their displayed name. Um, and you don't have to like do this directly, like, what is your pronoun? What is your pronoun? You can make like a Google form asking for the contact information, the preferred name, and the preferred pronouns. And it's a really easy way to start that conversation. And also, just because an individual dresses towards typical cisgendered apparel does not mean they identify as such gender. Like I said, the gender binary is all encompassing, it's very broad. And also, during these times as students, they may not have the access or feel comfortable truly dressing as they identify. So, just taking that into consideration as well, because these students are learning about themselves just as much as you are of them, and vice versa. Because there's a sense of trust that has to build from empathy, just like what we talked about. So it's a long, steady process. And it leads into this quote that I actually heard about from a discussion with Ken from Shelley Durbin, who is a local teacher of Kennedy Middle School. And it goes, "I realized that my best teachers inspired me to be the teacher that I am today, and the worst teachers inspired me to be a teacher." And I laughed at it at first because it really resonated with me. Because my high school director really wasn't the individual that struck me as phenomenal. Didn't really do a lot to reach out, go out of his way to help me individually. So that inspired me to be a teacher. And then I got here to college, and I've always felt so inspired and have always felt this confirmation of becoming a great teacher because of these individuals. So this is something that has really stuck with me. And then finally, I've just listed a few resources to help us get on the right track. Like I said earlier, the Human Rights Campaign, super good resource. They do a lot of studies, especially for LGBTQ plus youth. Same thing with the Trevor Project. They have a lot of lifelines for queer people in particular. Then you have the GSA, Gender and Sexualities Alliance Network. If you ever want to get in contact with maybe a local chapter or starting one of your own in your school, that is a really great resource for that. Also GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. They also do a lot of resource and research for queer students and teachers, as you can see. And then also the California Alliance for Arts Education, and most obviously the CMEA website and NAfME website. Really, really great resources that they have in terms of helping us teach during these times and how to go about teaching empathy and all these other concepts that we've really rounded out today. So, with that, thank you so much for coming to my presentation. I really appreciate it. I know a lot of you are from San Jose State, so I really appreciate all of your support, all of your help, and I hope we all got something out of this conversation. So thank you. Izzy, I think you can stop it now.